On my 34th birthday, after 3 hours of smiling at the lakeside cabin my grandmother had left me in her will and that my family had been using as if it were theirs for 6 years, my father came to stand beside me on the terrace with a beer in his hand and told me, in the specific tone of someone who believes they are sharing an affectionate confidence, that I should know they had discussed at length whether to invite me that weekend, that some people had thought it was a better not to, and that in the end they had decided to include me out of pity, because deep down family is family, and I looked at him for a moment with my glass in my hand and the lake behind us reflecting the afternoon sun, and I said nothing, and I nodded, and I kept smiling, and that night when everyone was asleep I sat on the dock with my feet hanging over the water and made the most important decision I had made in years, which was to stop asking permission to protect myself. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, quiet justice, and people who discover too late that actions have consequences, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because we share stories like this every day. My name is Sophie. I am 34 years old. I work as a systems analyst at an educational technology company, and for 6 years I was what my family would have described, if someone had asked them with enough honesty to get an honest answer, as the person who had the cabin, which was a description that said everything about how they saw me and nothing about what I had meant to my grandmother Rose, who was the person who had left it to me, and who had left it to me not because I was her only grandchild, but because I was the one who had spent every summer of my childhood and every Christmas of my adolescence at that cabin helping her maintain it, the one who had learned to fix the water pump when it failed, the one who knew the name of every tree on the property, the one who had been with her during the last 3 weeks of her life when no one else could make the trip, and who upon dying had left written in a perfectly clear will that the cabin and the land on which it stood were for me and only for me, with a handwritten note in the margin saying she hoped I would take care of it as she had taken care of it, and that was exactly what I had tried to do for 6 years while my family used it as a private hotel. The dynamic had begun the first summer after my grandmother's death, when my Aunt Barbara called to ask if she could bring her children to the cabin for 2 weeks in July because a Rose would always have allowed it. And I said yes because it was true and because at that moment I was still processing the loss of my grandmother and did not have the energy to set conditions, and that first summer became the precedent on which all the following ones were built, because in families precedents are more powerful than any explicit agreement, and the precedent I had established was that the cabin was available, and available to my family meant available to whoever wanted it, whenever they wanted, for as long as they wanted, with a notice that over the years had gone from being a request to being a notification and from being a notification to simply being information about the dates they would arrive. What I paid in relation to the cabin was a list that had grown gradually without anyone naming it for what it was. I paid the annual property tax, I paid the property insurance, I paid the maintenance of the electrical system and the water pump, I paid for repairs when something broke, which was frequent because a wooden cabin beside a lake requires constant attention or it deteriorates quickly, and I paid to replace everything that broke or disappeared during my family's stays, which included everything from dishes to a canoe my cousin Ernest had damaged and that no one had mentioned until I arrived and found it half sunk along the bank, and none of those expenses had been compensated by anyone at any point, not because I had asked and been refused, but because the question had never been raised, because the question would have broken the tacit agreement that I was the owner on the documents and my family was the owner in practice. My father, Gerald, was the family member who most clearly embodied that dynamic, not because he was the most active in using the cabin but because he was the one who had most naturally adopted the language of ownership when speaking about it. He said our cabin in conversations with friends. He said when we go to the lake as if the decision to go were his to make, and had developed in the last 2 years the habit of inviting his own friends to the cabin without consulting me, which I had discovered on 2 occasions by arriving and finding people I did not know using the space with the comfort of those who have been invited by the owner. And when I had carefully raised this both times, my father had responded that they were a trustworthy people and that I was too rigid about the property. And I had dropped the subject because the alternative was a conflict I did not know how to sustain without losing something I valued more than the cabin, which was the possibility of continuing to be part of that family however uncomfortable and asymmetrical that belonging was. A phrase on the dock, "We invited you out of pity." It was not the first time my father had said something that hurt me in a specific and irreparable way, but it was the first time he had said it with enough clarity and enough nearby witnesses that I could not reinterpret it as a misunderstanding or a social blunder. It was the first time the mechanism was completely visible. The first time the structure I had been sustaining with my silence and my patience showed itself from the inside with all the clarity of something that no longer needs to disguise itself because it assumes the other party will not react, and that assumption, that certainty of my family that I was not going to react, was what hurt me most on the dock that night, more than the phrase itself, more than 6 years of free use, more than the sunken canoe and the weekends of strangers in my cabin, because that certainty was the direct result of everything I had stayed silent about. And what I had stayed silent about, I had stayed silent about myself. On the dock that night I called my attorney, Claudia Ferrin, a professional who had handled the probate process when my grandmother died and with whom I had maintained sporadic contact during the 6 years since, and I left her a voice message that was longer than I expected because once I started talking I found there was more to say than I had realized, and I told her I needed a meeting as soon as possible, that there were things related to the property I needed to review urgently, and that I believed the moment had come to make changes I should have made much earlier. And I hung up, and I sat on the dock a little longer looking at the lake, and then I went back inside the cabin and slept better than I had in months. Claudia called me Monday morning, 2 days after the birthday, and when I explained the complete situation in a 40-minute call that included the 6 years of uncompensated use, my father's guests, the phrase on the dock, and the list of expenses I had been covering, she was quiet for a moment and then asked me whether I had access to all the original succession documents, and I told her yes, that I kept them in a folder at my apartment along with all the expense receipts I had preserved for reasons that at the time were purely organizational and that now turned out to be something more valuable, and she told me she would review them carefully before our meeting and that there was something she wanted to verify before we saw each other, and the tone with which she said that, a tone I recognized as the tone of someone who already has a hypothesis and needs to confirm it, produced an unease in me I could not name until we met in her office 2 days later. What Claudia showed me at that meeting was something I had not been looking for and had never imagined finding. It was an inconsistency in the property documents that she had detected by comparing my grandmother's original testamentary deed with a use modification document that appeared registered 3 years ago in the property registry, a document establishing that the cabin could be used as a shared family-use property, under certain conditions, and that bore my signature, and that I had not signed. And when Claudia showed me that document and asked whether I recognized the signature, I looked at it for several seconds because I needed to be completely certain of what I was going to say. And what I said was that that was not my signature, that I had never signed that document, that I had never seen that document, and that I did not know how it had arrived at the property registry with my name on it. Claudia did not change expression when I said that, which told me it was not a surprise to her but a confirmation, and she explained that the document had been filed with the registry 3 years ago bearing a signature that visually resembled mine but had specific differences that an expert analysis could document, and that the legal effect of that document, if unchallenged, was to create a basis for arguing that the property had a shared use status that could complicate any unilateral decision I might want to make about it in the future, and that the moment I had wanted to sell or restrict access I would have encountered that document as an obstacle, and that someone in my family knew this, and that person had acted 3 years ago anticipating exactly that scenario, and I sat in front of Claudia processing that information with a part of my brain that understands facts before the part that feels them catches up. What followed that meeting was a process Claudia conducted with an efficiency I found simultaneously reassuring and revealing. The first step was to commission an expert analysis of the signature on the questioned document. The second was to review whether other documents existed in the property registry that I had not signed or authorized. And the third was to prepare a formal challenge to the use modification document while I still had time to do so without additional complications. And while that process advanced, I did something Claudia had suggested indirectly and that I would have done regardless because it is what I do when I need to understand a situation, which was to carefully review all the financial documentation related to the cabin I had accumulated over 6 years, and it was during that review that I found something Claudia had not mentioned to me because she did not yet know about it. What I found was a rental contract, a contract signed 2 years ago that rented the cabin to a rural tourism company for 3 weekends per month during peak season. with a monthly amount I had never received, and that according to the contract was to be deposited into an account that was not mine but had my name in the document header. And the contract bore a signature that was also not mine but was similar enough to have passed the rental company's registration process. And when I calculated the total amount of deposits that would have occurred over 2 years of contract, my stomach did something it had not done in a long time, which was to recognize that what I had in front of me was not a dysfunctional family dynamic but something that had a specific legal name and specific legal consequences. I called Claudia that same afternoon with photographs of the documents, and she reviewed them that night and called me the following day with a voice that had the specific calm of someone who has processed something difficult and arrived at the other side of that processing. And she told me that what I had found was evidence of unauthorized commercial use of the property and appropriation of income that belonged to me, which added to the forged signature document configured a situation that went beyond family conflict and entered territory she recommended handling with the most serious legal resources available, and that she had a proposal for how to proceed that she wanted to explain to me in person. And we met that afternoon, and when I left her office 3 hours later I had a plan covering the next 5 days with a precision I could never have built alone, and that was, in every sense, exactly proportional to what my family had built over 6 years believing I would never discover it. The night before the plan was activated I did not call anyone in my family. I sent no messages. I did nothing that could be interpreted as a signal of what was about to happen. I simply went to the cabin alone. The last time I would visit it under the conditions in which I had visited it for 6 years, and I walked through each room with an attention that was not nostalgia but recognition. I recognized the wooden floor I had waxed twice a year. I recognized the windows I had replaced for years ago when the original ones no longer closed properly. I recognized the dock where my grandmother and I had spent hundreds of afternoons talking about things that at the time seemed small and that I now understood had been the construction of something important. And before leaving I sat in the same spot on the dock where I had sat the night of my birthday, and I said to my grandmother Rose, very quietly, that I was going to take care of the cabin exactly as she had asked me to, and that was precisely what I was going to do. On the 5th day after my birthday, at 9 in the morning, Claudia simultaneously activated 3 actions we had prepared with the precision of someone who understands that in law, as in many other things, the order and timing matter as much as the content. The first was the formal filing with the property registry of the challenge to the use modification document with the expert report confirming the signature was forged. The second was the formal notification to the Rural Tourism Company that had been renting the cabin that the contract under which they were operating was invalid because it had been signed by someone who had no authority to sign it, and that they were required to cease all operations related to the property immediately and provide a complete report of all deposits made during the 2 years the contract had been in effect. And the third was a letter addressed to my father, my Aunt Barbara, and my cousin Ernest, who were the 3 people Claudia and I had identified as most probably involved in constructing that structure, establishing that I was aware of the documents, that I had documented evidence, and that my legal options included a formal complaint that would have consequences I preferred to avoid if the situation were resolved directly and documentably within 15 days. My phone began ringing at 11 that morning and did not stop for the rest of the day. My father called 7 times before noon. My Aunt Barbara sent me 12 messages within 2 hours ranging from accusation to pleading without passing through any intermediate point that could be described as honesty. My cousin Ernest called once and left no message, and a number I did not recognize called 3 times, and that when I looked it up turned out to be the Rural Tourism Company whose representative wanted to clarify the situation. And I did not answer any of those calls that day because Claudia had told me all communications needed to go through her while the process was active, and because I had learned in the past 5 days that the distance between knowing what needs to be done and having the calm to do it without emotional noise interfering is a distance that is traveled more easily when you have someone beside you who knows exactly what to do with that noise. The Rural Tourism Company cooperated quickly, which Claudia told me was to be expected because they had also been victims of a fraudulent contract and had no interest in complicating their own legal situation. And the deposit report they sent confirmed that over 24 months they had made regular payments totaling $43,000 that had gone to an account bearing my name in the header but that I had never opened. And when Claudia showed me that number, I processed it there. Same way I had processed everything else in those days, with the specific calm of someone who has already passed through the part where they feel things and has arrived at the part where they manage them. My father called me on the third day in a voice I had never heard from him. It was not the voice of authority or the voice of persuasion or the voice of grievance. It was the voice of someone who has received a lawyer's letter and understood for the first time in his life that actions have consequences that are not resolved with a family conversation. And what he told me was that he wanted to talk, that everything had been a misunderstanding, that he had never wanted to hurt me, and that he hoped we could resolve things within the family. And I listened to him completely and then told him I understood he wanted to talk, and that he could talk to Claudia, and that Claudia was available to receive him with his own attorney at times she would indicate to him, and that I was not going to have any conversation about the situation outside that context, and my father did not respond immediately, and the silence that followed was the silence of someone who has just understood that their game has changed and that the rules that worked before no longer apply. The decision to sell the cabin was not a decision I made in a moment of anger and was not part of the original plan Claudia and I had built. It was a decision I made 3 weeks after everything began, when the legal process was advancing with the solidity Claudia had anticipated, and when I sat one afternoon in my apartment with a cup of coffee and asked myself a question I had not asked before, which was what I actually wanted with that cabin. Not what I had the right to do, but what I wanted to do. And the answer I found was that the cabin had been the place where I had been happy with my grandmother, and that for 6 years it had been the place where I had been invisible with my family, and that those two things coexisted in the same space, and that I had to decide whether I could keep going to that place with the second superimposed on the first, and the honest answer was that I could not, and that that was not a defeat but simply the truth, and that the truth deserved to be acted upon. I listed the cabin for sale through a real estate agent Claudia recommended. The price was the market price without discounts and without family considerations, and it sold in 6 weeks to a young family with 2 children and a dog who, when they signed the paperwork, told me they had been looking for exactly that kind of place for 2 years, and I handed them the keys and explained where the water pump valve was and which tree needed attention in spring. And when I left that cabin for the last time, I did so with the same calm with which I had entered it 5 days after my birthday, because what I was leaving behind was not the place where I had been happy with my grandmother, but the structure my family had built on top of that place. And those two things, though they occupied the same physical space, were not the same. The legal process with my father, my aunt, and my cousin took for months to resolve and was resolved through an agreement Claudia negotiated with their respective attorneys. An agreement that included restitution of the money from the fraudulent rental contract, formal acknowledgement that the use modification document had been filed with an unauthorized signature, and a letter all three signed that documented the facts in the way Claudia considered necessary to protect my position in their future. And none of the three called me during those for months outside the legal channels, which I interpreted not as hostility but as the recognition that the rules had changed and that the channel they had used for 6 years, which was my willingness to keep the peace at any cost, was no longer available. My Aunt Barbara sent me a message for months after the agreement, a message I did not expect and that I read 3 times before responding, telling me she understood I had had reasons for doing what I had done and that she hoped that with time we might have some kind of relationship, and I responded that I hoped so too, and that that relationship, if it came to exist, would have to be built on different foundations than those that had existed before. And that I was open to that but was in no hurry, and that whatever time I needed to reach that point was the time it was going to take. And she responded that she understood, and there the conversation rested, open without being urgent, which was exactly the state in which I could sustain it. What I learned from all of this has a clarity that it could not have had if I had learned it in any way other than by living it, which is that the silence practiced to protect a relationship does not protect the relationship, but protects the people who benefit from that relationship not being examined, and that the moment the silence ends is not the moment the relationship is destroyed, but the moment what was underneath it is revealed. And what was underneath 6 years of my silence was a structure my family had built on the assumption that I would never look carefully enough to see it, and that my father's phrase on the dock, "We invited you out of pity," it was not a spontaneous cruelty but the miscalculation of someone so certain I would not react that he allowed himself to say out loud what until that moment they had only thought in silence, And that miscalculation was the strangest and most useful gift my family gave me in 34 years, because it was what allowed me to see with complete clarity what I had been choosing not to see, and to act from that clarity with the same precision and the same patience with which my grandmother Rose had cared for that cabin for 40 years before leaving it to me.